Thanks for having me. I love coming to Joe's. This is one of those stores that you got everything at Joe's, right? If you need something, you can run in here. I always love talking to the staff here. They're all fish heads like us. They enjoy fishing. They usually have some pretty good advice, right? Or you can still deploy. Some of the techniques might be a little bit review if you've been to one of my seminars before. I talk a lot about power fishing techniques, different things to target walleyes as far as casting and moving around. I still do a ton of trolling, pulling bottom mounts or crankbaits. That's not exactly what this seminar is about. However, if you have any questions after the seminar or something that relates to your particular body of water that you like fishing, feel free to come up and ask. Or if I glanced over something that you didn't understand, feel free. I'll be around afterward to ask questions and that sort of thing. But when it comes to forward-facing sonar, things have evolved in the sense where, now we're targeting specific fish, whereas before it was like you'd see a group of fish, hopefully drift over the top of them or cast to them or just blind fishing at various times, where now I know how many fish are in that area because of forward-facing sonar. I use it all the time. I use Lowrance Active Target, but whether you use Lowrance, Garmin, Humminbird, it's all apples to apples. Seeing and getting comfortable finding fish with your electronics is a lot easier now. When you're using live sonar, it's way easier. I always tell people, I got a slide here of some old electronics my buddy just sent me. He rigs boats, and he got this boat, and it was just, a pristine boat, and the electronics were almost brand new in this boat. But if you look here, the old Lowrance unit, a lot of people still went with flashers because you could see it instantly, right? Everything was instant. That's what's cool about forward-facing sonar. It's instant, but instead of looking straight down, it's out forward-facing, okay? But if I see a lot of people shaking their heads on the flasher thing, a lot of these graphs weren't instant, right? They were writing in there, and it took time, and there was a delay, and there was a lag, and there was a learning curve as far as what you were seeing. Plus, a lot of these transducers weren't that sensitive, so a lot of anglers, up until even 10 years ago, some of them still had flashers on their boat just because they knew that if they read fish, it was instant, right? And that's what I like about forward-facing sonar. The images are much clearer. I use all of the electronics that I have to my advantage. I use multiple units. I isolate a unit for forward-facing sonar, but I do still use side imaging. I use down imaging. I also use mapping technology, so I know exactly where I'm at, and I sort of divide some of the units.
Can we turn down the lights in front at all?
Yeah.
The one closest to you there. Yep.
So what's that going to do for?
We'll figure it out.
All right. So here are just some Lowrance units. Prime example of really studying your electronics. When I first got side imaging, it took me a really long time to drive around and decipher exactly what I'm seeing. With forward-facing sonar, you know what you're seeing. You can see fish, rocks, vegetation, fish in the vegetation. But even with side imaging, I still use side imaging. For example, I was just out in Green Bay, and we were fishing these big, expansive, shallow water flats. Well, I drive around with side imaging on 60, 80, 100 feet out. That way, if I see these fish, I can spin around and then either put my trolling motor with my forward-facing sonar or sonar on a pole, and then I can shoot at those fish. But I see those fish on side imaging. As you can see here, here's one image of a bunch of fish. You can see the fish in the shadows. But it took me time to really kind of decipher that when I first started using that. If you're still having troubles with side imaging, for example, my best advice that I can give you is shrink down, maximize that screen as big as you can go, but don't look out, 60, 80, 100 feet. Shrink it down to about 50 feet, okay, and then drive around. A really good spot to get to really hone your skills as far as finding fish if you go up to the north end of Mille Lacs Lake, or you go on Leech Lake or Winnebagosh, where it's these sandy bottoms and you don't have a lot of vegetation in the spring, you can drive with side imaging until you start seeing fish, and you'll start seeing schools of bait fish, and you can get really comfortable. What's cool about Lowrance is you can actually click on that and touch the screen. Most of the new Lowrances are all touch screen, so if you touch the screen, it'll blow up that screen so you can really take a look at it. It'll magnify that screen. So running that in 40 or 50 feet either direction, you're really going to be able to tell what you're seeing there. And then the other slides I have up here, like this is down viewing. Here's forward facing. We'll get into that. But the difference between this and forward facing, a lot of times in those shallow water situations when you're driving around in the past, when you were only using 2D sonar, you know, it's amazing how much we're spooking fish. And now we're seeing it with forward facing sonar. Whereas before you just drive around and there's no fish here. Well, you're under 10 feet of water, your cone size is tiny versus something that's shooting out like this, where I can scan 50, 60, 70, 80 feet out, and I can really cover a big swath. Like right now with forward facing sonar, I can go on in any lake, any body of water, and I can break it down very quickly. But I don't just pull up to a spot and start fishing. I pull up to a spot and I'll scan the entire weed line, or I'll scan the entire structure before I start fishing, because I want to get a layout of not only where the fish are at and adjacent to the structure, but also I want to see the size structure of fish, where they're at in the water column. Like I'm processing all this information as I'm scanning. So in my boat, what I do is I'll actually isolate a unit just for forward facing, or like that is in scout mode. You're seeing scout mode, same thing, but I'm isolating that screen particularly just for forward facing sonar. And then my other screen, I'll have side imaging and then maybe 2D sonar or my map. If you only have one unit, okay, just toggle back and forth in between the settings. Like once you get to a spot, let's say you have side imaging on, for example, and you found a bunch of walleyes and you want to toggle over to active target or your forward facing sonar, then I'll toggle over, but I'll utilize the entire screen. When I first started using forward facing sonar, I had shrunk the screen down to kind of use it with the other features on my graph, mapping, that sort of thing. When you shrink that screen down so small, it's hard to see anything. So to get very good at using your forward-facing sonar, try to isolate one particular screen or dedicate one screen to that. If you don't want to invest a ton of money in new electronics, if you have an ice bundle, it's easy to do that and put it in your boat. Like, for example, I have a Lund, so I have a sport track system. I can easily take one of my ice bundles, which I do, and in the summer, I put it on my boat. If you don't, let's just say you have a 14-foot boat, just plain wall gunnels and a bench seat, they make a clamp system that clamps right on the side of any sort of aluminum boat that you can just clamp it on there, and now you have forward-facing sonar. My son has a unit that he puts on his little 14-foot boat that he can use anywhere. I take that same unit, I put it on my pontoon on a clamp, and now I can use it on my pontoon. You know, it's that simple to use. So a couple things, like, you know, obviously I'm an extreme example because I fish every single day. So I have multiple forward-facing sonar units, but I have one on a pole and one on a trolling motor. Okay, most bass anglers only have it on their trolling motor. However, I fish a ton of rough water all the time. It's windy all the time, rough. I have to spot lock a lot, especially with customers. And so I have one on my trolling motor, but I also have one on a pole. And I also will bring an ice bundle with me if I have multiple people in the boat that are comfortable using forward-facing sonar, so that, you know, they can be throwing at their own fish at you know, different at the same time or different times. But having the one on the trolling motor is super nice for running down fish and fishing shallow, but it basically becomes obsolete if you have the spot lock. And so it's nice to have it on a pole if you tend to spot lock a lot, which I do. And then, you know, with my electronics too, it's like I said I'm not just seeking out structure and fish on the structure. I'm deciding what's my best approach to those fish. A lot of times I'm seeing where they're at in the water column. That'll dictate kind of how I'm going to fish that day. You know, so many people with forward-facing sonar in walleye fishing, they'll spot lock and throw a bobber on them, and that's fine. We'll get into bobber fishing. We'll get into plastics. That's fine. I'm not saying that's wrong, but there's so many different presentations you can use with forward-facing sonar where you can actually watch them strike, or you're pitching at schools and you can get a reactionary bite out of them even if they're not feeding. And so I'm always hunting down fish. The other thing that I do that's really helpful, and what I like about the Lowrance screens, is like you see these big boulders here on side imaging. I mark a lot of structure. And so I'm always clicking on like boulders, cabbage, weed edges. I'm putting down icons, and I categorize those icons in a sense where I use an icon that will jog my memory to what that is. And an example of that is if you go in my my log of waypoints right now, there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, I don't know, 8,000 maybe. Well, if they were all just blue dots, I would be so confused as far as what that is. And so what I do is I will categorize my icons by using particular icons that relate to things. Like these big boulders, I'll actually use the rock icon, okay? If it's a shelf or an edge or a transition, I have a different icon that I use for that. If it's a weed line, like cabbage weeds in particular, or a real sharp weed line, I'll use an icon that's a weed that looks like a vegetation so that I know what I'm looking at. Because I always say fish swim, but generally bottom composition doesn't move, right? Big boulders are not going to move. They're always going to be there. And so that cuts down the time in which I have to look for things. Sometimes I mark fish, but rarely do I mark fish unless I'm like pre-fishing for a tournament or, it's a big fish spot. There's certain spots that just hold big fish. I have icons for that. You'll see a lot with forward-facing sonar. If you're getting packs of fish, packs of walleyes, packs of bass, for example, that they're generally smaller fish than the individuals. And forward-facing sonar, really, I fish out the entire lake now, or the entire river. I used to be really spot-specific and structure-oriented. Now I can fish wherever I want. I've caught giant walleyes 4 feet down over 30 feet of water out in the middle of nowhere. And then I've caught walleyes up in 4 feet of water, midsummer, dead flat calm, because I was able to see them on forward-facing sonar, whereas before I wouldn't even look for them. Prime example, last year I fished a lake and I really had in mind that I was going to fish off the edge of the weed lines. I was finding lots of walleyes. That time of year on different lakes off the edge of the weed line, some were suspended, some were on the bottom, some were on mid-lake humps. And I had to run into the landing to pick up my buddy, right? And I have this just all the time when I'm running around looking for fish, I keep my forward-facing sonar down on my pole. So instead of running wide open in to go pick up my buddy, he was taking his sweet time at the landing. He wasn't quite there yet. I drove in really slow because I wanted to analyze actually the weed line itself. I wanted to get into the vegetation and find pockets within that cabbage to find walleyes. Well, I stumbled upon the inside edge of the weed line that stopped at 4 feet and then became a big sand flat. And it was loaded with walleyes, absolutely loaded. So that's a particular spot that I would have never, ever, ever looked for had I not had forward-facing sonar, because I would have drove over them. Even with side imaging in that shallow water, I would have never saw them. And so I found those fish, ended up fishing them. Surface temp was 75 degrees. It was glass calm, but there was walleyes all over on the inside edge of the weed line because that's where all the bait was at. There was a bunch of either perch or whatever, and they were relating to the inside edge, not the outside edge. And so that's why it's nice when you're driving around to have that on that pole, that you're constantly looking for fish, because there's so many times you stumble upon those fish that you would have never thought were there. So here's just a quick little video that sort of shows, You know, you can fish. A lot of anglers are fishing right on their side imaging or forward-facing sonar. Like most of the time, I'm casting to fish and I'm watching them strike my bait. I do it all the time. We'll talk about presentations, particularly tungsten jigs now that are coming out that they're designed particularly so you can see those better than your lead head jigs. Okay, so here are kind of the configurations. This is all on the trolling motor, but you can do the same thing on the pole. It's forward, down viewing, and scout mode. Scout mode, or if you run a Garmin, it's perspective mode. It's basically, instead of shooting out like this in the water column, you're shooting like this. And you can get a wider band. So in shallower water, let's say in 10 feet of water, or even, I usually use it in like under 5 feet of water, for example, or under 6 feet of water. You put it in perspective mode. Now you can see the fish in a wider view. And so that way, if you're scanning, instead of having that real small image that's pinched down where you can't see out that far, you can see much further in perspective mode or scout mode than you can, let's say, in forward-facing sonar in shallower water, because you lose that distance, right? If I'm in 4 or 5 feet of water, I start to lose. I can only see out, let's say, 30 or 40 or 50 feet. Whereas in perspective mode, I can really track down fish. I can see them underneath docks. I can see them along the banks, wherever in perspective mode. But this is where you kind of have your trolling motor set. I don't down view a lot except for ice fishing. You know, there's times where I'll down view ice fishing. I don't do a ton of down viewing in open water. There are times like in the fall crappie fishing last year, I was catching them on jigging wraps like 15 feet down over like 25 feet of water. And I ended up just clicking my trolling motor down because there were so many underneath me. So I was down viewing with the jigging wrap and catching them. But most of the time I just forward shoot and you can still see the fish. You can see them all around you, even in forward. And I would say 85% of the time I use it in forward view anyway, just the depths I'm fishing and the walleyes I'm chasing. Don't get too hung up on the position of it. You know, so many people look at their pole and they see the 3 notches or whatever it is, depending on the brand, and they get worried like, is it up too far? Is it down? You'll see that on your unit. If it's shooting up too far, it'll look wonky on your screen, or it'll be black where you're not seeing the seams of that juicer. So that was one of the hangups I had when I first got forward facing. Like, do I have it up too far? You know, you'll see it on your screen. You don't have to kind of concern yourself with that. So here's just an image in forward. I'll have more forward facing, but we're just shooting out. You can see some fish in here. Here's actually a bait there. There's a fish down below. You can see some fish out here. There's down viewing. This is actually a ledge that drops off, and there's a bunch of bait fish up on top of this rock, but it's a steep drop off there. There's perspective. You can see some fish sitting here. These bright, you'll see them. They're like little beacons that show up. Okay. I'll get into different setups, different presentations for different types of presentations that I'm using. So in this, I like using a longer bobber rod. Bobbers in particular, and I'll get to some bobber setups here. Bobbers are really nice for if you're just getting into forward-facing sonar use. It's really nice to be able to cast a bobber out there, see your bait drop, kind of point at it because you see the float on the surface, and really get comfortable at seeing that presentation drop and then watching fish come up to it, okay? I like having a longer rod for bobber fishing because, again, I fish a lot of lakes that are super windy. It's rough all the time. It's nice to have that longer rod where you can throw that out there without whipping it and losing your bait. I like to use like a medium light, extra fast action rod, either 6-pound or 8-pound mono. What I like about mono and what I like about Suffix mono in particular, it's low stretch. I like monofilament. I like the way that it slides through a lot of these bobbers. If I'm going to use a float or a bobber, I tend to use one that has that brass fitting on the top. And we'll go through the slip bobber here in a minute. But something like that. And then, whereas if I'm pitching now, I tend to use like a 6'8", 6'10", 7 foot, 7'1", more of a medium type of rod with extra fast. I want it to load up nicely, or I don't want it. I want it to load up instantly. And then I tend to use like a 10-pound Suffix 832 braid as my main line, and then a fluorocarbon leader. And the reason I like that fluorocarbon leader versus monofilament is, first of all, you can feel everything, but the main reason is zebra mussels. Most of our lakes that have zebra mussels, if you're using monofilament, you're getting cut off all the time. That they're so sharp that they will instantly cut your line. And you know, with the fluorocarbon, it's much more abrasion resistant than the monofilament. Another thing is, if you got a lake that, you know, you got a lot of pike in, try, you know, running a fluorocarbon leader versus even just tying braid direct. It's going to be a lot more abrasion resistant. You can use, you know, 10-pound, 12-pound. I use a lot of 12-pound even when I'm throwing plastics or jerk baits or jig wraps or whatever. If you're getting bit off by pike, you can just simply upsize your fluorocarbon leader. I tend to, my leader length, I usually start with a 2 to 3 footer, depending on you know, what I'm throwing, but it's just comfortable. If you get too long a leader, sometimes when you're trying to pitch, it screws you up as far as your casting. So, all right, I'll get into my sort of my float setup, just because you know, float fishing is a big part of forward-facing sonar right now, and especially if you're first getting started walleye fishing with your forward-facing sonar. This is my setup to a T. Okay, I've already described the rods, kind of in that, you know, 7.5 foot range. It's the slip knot, the bead. Again, I like a bobber that has that brass fitting on top. Okay, I'm using a monofilament line, and then an egg sinker. And then I usually will put a bead down here just so it's not screwing up my knot. That little egg sinker knocking into your knot all the time can screw up that knot to the sense where you could break off. So I'll tend to put a bead, a swivel, and then like a 16th ounce jig. All right, that's pretty much my float setup when I'm fishing with forward-facing sonar. And what I like about the egg sinker, like right there, it says 1/8 ounce to quarter. That's not really true. That's if I'm fishing a little deeper, if it's really windy. Most of the time, I'll use like a 16th ounce or an 1/8 ounce. That's more common for my egg sinker. Because if you start getting into those quarter ouncers, you need to upsize your bobber a little bit. Otherwise, it'll just be pulling your float down. And so you have to go with a little bit bigger float system. As far as my leader length, though, see how it says 1 to 3 foot fluorocarbon? You can either do fluorocarbon or monofilament if you're not touching the bottom. But I have gotten into a lot of situations now with forward facing where I'm pitching out to fish, and let's say it drops down and they're not reacting to it. I'll actually still use this same system, but I'll use a little bit longer lead. And there's been times like on Leech Lake, for example, where I had like I'd say a 2 to 3 foot leader. And as soon as I switched to a 3 or 4 foot leader or 5 foot leader, I started getting more bites. Okay, they didn't want that sinker dumping down in their face. That egg sinker drops super fast, boom, and it'll get down to the fish quickly. Sometimes they love that. They react to it and they smack it sort of like a jigging wrap dumping down close to them. They'll react to it. There's other times they don't want that. And so if I'm seeing that on forward-facing sonar where they're not liking that egg sinker dumping down on them, I'll just add a little bit longer to my lead. That's all I change, and then boom, you start getting strikes. And then just tipping that thing with a leech, a night crawler. I've used shiners early in the spring, float fishing. But again, what's nice is getting your distance down. That's the biggest thing, is when you start seeing fish out at 30, 40 feet, right? Okay, what's 30, 40 feet? Well, if you throw a float there with an egg sinker and you can dump it right on top of them, you can see your presentation coming down on your sonar, so you know exactly what distance out you are. And then once you start doing that with a float, you can start to get better at throwing jigs. Like right now, I throw a ton of jigs. I throw a lot of different jerk baits, different presentations, but I'm super good at judging distance. And so if the fish are out at 42 feet or 55 feet or 63 feet, like I'm really good at casting right at that distance. But it was because I threw a float a lot in the beginning to get comfortable at those distances. Okay. The other thing is like setting your bobber depth and setting your presentation depth to the fish that you're seeing on your sonar. So let's say I'm seeing the fish 14 feet down on my sonar, right? The majority of the schools are 14 feet down. I'll actually set my slip bobber to that depth that I'm seeing on my sonar. So I'll put a depth bomb on here, drop it down, you can see it fall, and then you'll know exactly what depth your presentation's at. If the fish are at 14 or 15 feet, for example, like 14, I'll set it at 13 or 12 and a half, because they're going to come up and hit it, especially on clear lakes like Mille Lacs or Leech is getting super clear now. I'll set my presentation a little bit above those fish, but I'm always setting it to my electronics. I'm not adjusting my depth with my arm length and just kind of guessing. I'm setting it. If you're not comfortable with your forward-facing sonar, you can do it with 2D sonar and set it right behind your transducer in the back of your boat and put a depth bomb on there and then just set the depth of your float accordingly. Okay, plastics. I love all the plastics that are coming out, not just for forward-facing sonar, but all the plastics that are hitting the market right now. Lifelike, you've got elastic type of plastics, you've got minnow profiles, you got straight tails, you've got all sorts of different plastics that we can fish, all sorts of different jig heads. I'll show you a few of the jig heads that I have and that I use in conjunction with different baits. But the two plastics that I fish a lot now, obviously with them hitting the market, would be Crush City. And then a few years ago, I think if you've been to my seminars before, or if you fished with me, Largo shads. I throw a lot of Largo shads. They come in 3-inch, 3.5, 4-inch sizes. And then the Crush Cities, I fish the Crush City paddle tails a lot. They're the Mayor, they're called. Here are the two predominant sizes that I use right here. What I like about these baits is they're super, super durable, right? You can throw these all day long and basically throw the same bait all day without pike ripping them up. Matter of fact, this is the bait that I had on last up at on the Rainy River, and we were just dragging paddle tails behind the boat. I was hoping to pitch on fish, as we saw them, but the water was so cold, I got a few fish pitching on them, but most of the time we had to drag it. So what we do is we throw it out behind the boat, and then we use forward-facing sonar to see the big school over here. We just drive the boat over there and then just kind of twitch the bait, but mainly just drag it and pop it and then drag it. And basically dragging paddle tails behind the boat, that's how we caught most of them. Our other go-to bait up there, and a real go-to bait if you're going out to Green Bay or in a lot of situations, is a hair jig. And I'll get into the hair jigs, but the moontail jig in particular is one of my favorites, for dragging. Last year, VMC came out with these quick strike rigs that have a little rubber grommet, so you can just add them to any hook or any jig you have. But what's nice about that hair jig, that big moontail with that long hair, if you add this treble hook, this little quick strike, those fish try to pin that bait to the bottom. So many times you end up hooking them with the treble where they don't even get the hook in their mouth. So kind of a nice feature. The jig heads that I use for pitching are kind of as listed here. There's a couple in particular that I use a lot. The Neon Moon Eye jig. Okay. They also have the Sleep jig, which is a little bit longer shank. I'll use those when I'm using like 4-inch baits, or I use the Sleep jig a lot if I'm throwing the straight tail freeloader. The other one that I use a lot is the hybrid swim head jig, and I'll show you how to rig the baits on those. And then lastly is the VMC tungsten moon eye jig. This one I use all the time now because of forward facing. You can see tungsten so much better than you can see lead on your forward facing sonar. It's like a vapor trail. I mean, it just, that return on there shows up so much better. So there's times where I'm pitching at fish, but I'm pitching at fish and watching them strike and seeing how they react to my baits. I'll almost always now switch over to tungsten if I'm swimming baits, or if I'm trying to work a bait through fish, or I want to track that bait to see exactly how the fish are reacting to that. So using that new Moon Eye VMC tungsten is one of my go-tos. So let's start with hair. I've said it in the seminars in the past. Yeah.
Sorry, just to talk about the plastics real quick. Do you find yourself starting with a larger swim bait, typically just to, see what's out there, like a 4 or 5 inch, and then kind of going down to a 3 inch? And then do you use a 3 inch plastic more universally?
Yes and no. I mean, there's time, certain times a year where I'll start with a bigger bait in a lot of the situations, but then there's other times like on Leech Lake, for example, where I'll start with a smaller profile bait, just because I know the 4-inch base up where I'm fishing is a little bit smaller. Or Mille Lacs, for example, sometimes when those spot tail shiners are still up shallow, I'll just throw on like a 3-inch like white or albino or something like that, because I know that's what they're feeding on. So I'll start with the 3-inch. But other times, like Green Bay or like up on the Rainy River, they did not want the 3-inch bait. They wanted 4-inch and bigger, and they, in that really dark water, they wanted those big profile baits where they can feel that, they feel it with their lateral line. And I'll talk more about plastics too. I'm going to break down how I rig them up, jig heads, that sort of thing. Hair jigs. So I've said it in seminars before, like prior to all these new hair jigs that are out, I always thought hair jigs were like for my grandpa, like in my grandpa's tackle box, or my dad's. Like I grew up in like the plastics hair or crankbaits, Rapala, hard baits. I didn't really fish hair jigs until maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. I started fishing hair jigs. Absolutely fell in love with them. I can't believe how lifelike hair is in the water. And I use marabou, I use bucktail, different types of bucktails for snap jigging, trolling, dragging. When we were just out in Green Bay, the bite was really slow and tough. But what you had to do to catch them is you threw a hair jig out there, okay? And then you did not jig it at all. You just reeled, right? And let it sit. Reel, let it sit. But that hair is constantly moving in the water, even though it's sitting on the bottom. So you didn't need to add any action to it. Whereas plastics, you're snapping them and moving them. That's where you're getting your action, whether it's a paddle tail or a straight tail or whatever. You need to, most of the time, swim that bait or move that bait to get them to move. Hair jig, if you throw a hair jig in the water, like a marabou, for example, or even a bucktail, and just watch the lake current or anything, it's moving that hair all the time. It undulates, it's constantly moving. And so you don't need to add a lot of action to that to make them effective. I don't even tip my hair jigs very often. I'm throwing them and either snapping them or swimming them like I just described. Again, this new Quick Strike is really cool. If you look at these, they've got a little, sorry, it's a little hard in the dark. I can review some of this at the end too. But there's a little rubber bait holder that goes on here. All right, it comes with the treble hook. It's just basically a stinger hook.
You want to just flip on the lights for a few minutes?
Yeah, is that helpful? Okay. Everybody blinded?
Takes care of a few minutes.
So this Quick Strike, it's VMC, it comes in varying lengths, but it has this little rubber bait keeper, basically, or hook keeper. And so when you have your hair jig, like so, the moon tail, let's open these up.
do, super simple to rig these on. You just slide it right through the rubber bait keeper. Okay, and then that treble hangs down there. See that? And when you're dragging it on the bottom, those fish pin it to the bottom. You go to reel or go to lift, and they're on there. Okay, it's just sort of like a jigging wrap. You know, a lot of times with the jigging wrap or ripping wrap, they try to pin that bait to the bottom as you're moving that bait. That little sort of quick strike rig on there or stinger hook is really helpful. And now you can apply those to your plastics or anything else. Stinger hooks have been around forever. It's just, I like that particular system because the older stinger hooks and stuff, a lot of them had to have a jig that was molded in, and now you can apply that to any jig head that you have with that quick strike rig.
So what was the brand of that stinger hook?
BMC makes it. Right here, Quick Strike, Pro Series Quick Strike. And they make some with bladed trebles, lots of different stinger models. So since I have the lights on, I'm just going to show you the different types of hair that I'm using. I like this moontail. It also has that aspirin head design, so it rises and falls really nice. If you like snap jigging hair, this BMC moontail is fantastic. Comes in a bunch of different colors, some really bright colors, perch colors, to more plain and dull. On Green Bay, it seemed like they wanted a lot of purples and blacks. That's always kind of the key out there. So that's why I had this in my box. Then bucktails. So I love using bucktail, these shorter bucktails like in spring. I will warn you though, pike love hair jigs. I don't know what it is about hair, but I mean, even more than paddle tails and plastics, they absolutely love them. And so making sure that you're using like a fluorocarbon leader with that is important. All right, you guys ready to go back in the dark here? You can still see me?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Oh, the image got twisted here. Sorry about that. But pitching, jigging wraps, and ripping wraps. I use jig wraps all the time. And I almost always have a jig wrap tied up in my boat on a rod, ready to deploy. So whether you're seeing fish on forward-facing sonar that you can pitch at, or even your 2D sonar. If you're listening to the seminar right now and you say, hey, I don't have forward-facing sonar, all I got is a graph in the back. I do a lot of what I used to call, power fishing, where I drive around with my big motor until I saw fish, and then I throw on them, right behind the boat. As soon as you mark them, boom, you throw on. Well, jigging wraps are a great bait to do that because they fall fast. Kind of like the egg sinker on your bobber presentation. That's going to drop down quickly. It doesn't matter how windy it is. And jig wraps are just absolutely effective. They're kryptonite to walleyes. But I also have this 2D image here just for you. So if you're driving over the top and you see a bunch of fish like that, you don't have to set a bobber depth or anything. You grab a jig wrap rod, you throw it out there, let it hit the bottom, and then rip it back. Now with jig wraps, what you want to do is throw it out there, and as I fish a jigging wrap, same thing, I want like this is a medium action rod with an extra fast tip. What I mean by extra fast is something that's going to load up right here, okay? A slow action rod would be like a ugly stick or something, right? That's a very slow action rod, or even like your medium light, fast action rigging type of rods that kind of load up slowly. So when you're rigging, you can drop back and lean into a fish. That's not the type of rod that you want. This one is a 13, it's a mid series, but it's extra fast tip, and it's going to give you plenty of backbone for setting the hook, okay? But it's also going to be able to absorb some head shakes as well, all right? It's not super stiff right to the rod tip. But with jigging wraps, I'll throw it out there, let it hit the bottom, and I'll let it free fall, okay? Because it's really important that jigging wraps swim as they fall, all right? They're real kind of erratic swimming. But I'll snap it up in the air. But see how I drop my rod tip back? I snap it, and then I'm dropping that rod tip. I'm not ripping it and then puppeteering that bait down. I'm snapping it and letting it free fall, okay? Picking up my slack, snapping it, letting it free fall, snapping it, just like that. So I'm putting it on a slack line. It's kind of like when you're fishing a jerkbait. When you're fishing a jerkbait, you snap it, but then you bring your rod tip back forward so it falls on a slack line and it gives it action to that bait. If you're ripping your jigging Wrap and then just walking it down, you're killing the action to that bait, not making it effective. So snap it, let it fall. The other thing that I see people doing that's a mistake, the jigging Wrap, they're just dragging it on the bottom like this, snapping it along the bottom, snapping it along the bottom, instead of snapping it up in the air. You want that bait to rise, fall. Okay, if you're just snapping a jigging Wrap off to the side like this, it's just dragging it along the bottom, picking up everything on the bottom. I can fish a jigging Wrap really clean as long as there's not like standing vegetation or timber or something like that in the rocks, sand, even stuff where there's a little bit of sandgrass, or I've had it even in stock vegetation. If I can get it in between there, I can fish it pretty clean. And if I feel some little sandgrass or something on there, I'll snap it a little bit harder to get that off. But keeping that up in the air, I can fish that jig Wrap pretty clean. And a lot of times, like here, you can kind of see there's some sandgrass on the bottom. This is actually a picture from Leech Lake. You can see my phone here, my fingernails, and my cassette phone case on my old phone. But you can see some sandgrass, but you can target these fish right in between here and, you know, not drag all this sandgrass in your way back. This is a cleaner bottom here versus up in here. And I'll pitch on, you know, individuals. Sometimes there'll be a big individual or schools of fish. I don't care. I mean, I try to get into areas, obviously, we're seeing frequency to fish before I decide to fish. But with the jigging Wrap, I mean, you can throw on one individual and catch them. I've even had it like out in the basin where the fish are suspended, let's say over 25 feet of water, and the fish are 10 feet down. I throw in a jigging Wrap out in front of them. That bait's falling to the bottom, and those walleyes will chase it all the way down to the bottom and strike it on the bottom. It's just incredible where these fish move in the water column and how they chase presentations and how they react to different baits. So, you know, the mindset of thinking, oh, I got to swim that bait in front of their face, that's not the case. They will follow that all the way down to the bottom. They do the same thing with plastics sometimes. Before I get into this, let me pop the lights on because I want to talk about rigging plastics on these jigs before I switch over to the next slide, okay? Because it's really important if we're going to break down presentations for pitching and using plastics, making sure that you're rigging your plastics properly. If you can see here, I've got a little moon eye jig with a Largo shad. See how it's rigged perfectly in the center? And then I also rigged it perfectly when I put the jig on the tip of this thing. If the bait isn't rigged perfectly on there, what happens is you get a lot of spinning action to your baits, or it's not running true. So how I do that, here's another one here. This is the hybrid swim head jig. Here's the tungsten moon eye. Let's just show you real quickly. So with the minnow, this is just a paddle tail, but it could be like a fork tail or a mooch minnow, doesn't matter, right? But with your plastic, you want to make sure that you're hitting that bait body dead center, okay? And that when you're popping this jig out mid-body, that you're also hitting it mid-center. A lot of these baits will have see how they've got a little slit in there? It'll kind of guide you to hit that plastic perfectly. It's really important to do that. Even this one, like this is the freeloader. What I like about this is it's got a straight tail minnow. It's got a little swimming action. If you followed any of the bass tournaments, the last year or two, the people winning the tournaments are absolutely crushing it on swimming minnows. And so having that rigged properly on there, again, perfectly dead center, and then popping that bait out so it's perfectly centered on that. And let's talk about swimming plastics and ripping plastics. Like the freeloader, for example. That's a Crush City freeloader, okay? I just filmed a Midwest Outdoors last summer of me throwing a freeloader for walleyes that were suspended on Mille Lacs Lake, whereas in the past, you know, the only way to target those fish would be trolling crankbaits, trolling lead core, that sort of thing. You can still do that. However, if you want to throw at them with forward-facing sonar, this is a great bait to do it. you can do it with a paddle tail as well and swim that bait past those fish's face. And so what I do is, if I'm seeing the fish, can you guys see this right here? Sorry, that slide got tipped upside down. But I'm shooting them out to the side. Okay, this is my bow. If you can see my pole here. I'm shooting these fish. What I'm doing is I'm casting my presentation. I'm watching it fall. So these fish are out at 70 feet. I'm watching my bait fall, and then I'm swimming it just above these walleyes, okay? And I'm using either a paddle tail or, like I said, the Crush City freeloader. And I'm throwing it out there, and then I'm just working that rod tip like this and just swimming that bait back, just like you would like a minnow, right? And these fish are coming up and absolutely smashing it. You can do it for bass, you can do it for walleyes. Pike will destroy your baits like they always do with every bait. But with the Crush City plastics, they're a lot more durable. They've got more of a elastic like body, like this is the mooch minnow. See that? They're a lot more durable, so you don't go through as many plastics as you used to. Because pike in particular shred plastics, not these. You can fit. I can catch 20 fish. I mean, look at that jig head on here. It's just terrible. I cut this off. I was actually using that jig head. But the plastic looks pristine condition. But that's what's nice about these Crush City plastics and what makes them so durable. This is another one that's a great swimming bait, is the Crush City mooch minnow. Well, bass anglers, same thing. You can work that tail. That tail has a great swimming action. Fantastic for all sorts of different species. Let me get one. I'll give you one more example of rigging here. Let me grab the hybrid swim head jig. Here they are. Now this is a little bit more challenging to get your baits on perfectly, but what's cool about this bait keeper here versus the other bait keepers is it's really going to stay on the line. Okay, so if you have a plastic you want to throw on there and you don't want it to fall off, this is a great one to do it, because it's going to stay on there a lot longer. So what you do is same thing. You're going to come up mid-body, or right there, right in the middle, right? And then I'm going to come up where I normally hook this bait, okay? But then I'm just going to twist it on this bait keeper. Like that, all right? And then that's going to keep that bait on there longer. So when the fish come up and grab it, they're not going to pull your skirt down. It's going to stay on there. And that's what's nice about these VFC hybrid swim head jigs, is the plastics stay on forever, right? Because of that bait keeper. So. All right, so forward-facing sonar, the biggest thing that I like is the way I can break down bodies of water quicker, right? I gave you prime examples of me finding fish on the inside of the weed lines. You find them on the outside of the weed lines. If you really want to get comfortable with your electronics, I always tell people spend a ton of time looking at your electronics and not fishing. I know it's tough to do, like when you have families or friends, I always get it too, like, I've been guiding all week or fishing all week, but I go to take my son or my daughter out or my kids out or their buddies out fishing, and they want to get fishing right away, right? You got that stress of that. But I recommend if you just picked up some new electronics or you're planning to do so, get them rigged up on your boat, but then get out to the lake and just do some looking before you have anyone in the boat. Don't even worry about fishing. I used to go out on Mille Lacs Lake like just before opener, for example, or if you live on leech or you fish leech, go out the day before opener and just do some scanning, or the weekend before opener. If it's a nice calm day, just do some scanning with your forward-facing sonar and just look for fish. I've done it on Mille Lacs a lot where I've gone out like the day before opener. I don't even have any rods in my boat. I'm just driving around looking for fish. I want to see what the surface temperature is in different locations. I want to see where the fish are at. I want to see what they look like. I used to do it with side imaging all the time. Now I do it with forward-facing sonar. I just drive around and look for fish. The other thing that I would do is getting your distances down. Before you start trying to swim baits in front of fish, don't worry about that. Tie on a float with that exact setup with the egg sinker and start dumping it at different distances to see what that is. The other thing is when you start to get into vegetation and some things where you may not know what it is there, right? Take your forward facing sonar, the lake that you choose, make sure it's super clear water, right? I would take mine out to a lake where it's absolutely gin clear. That way I can shoot at something. If it's dead flat calm, okay, what am I looking at here? Is that cabbage weeds? Is that coontail? Is that a tree limb? I don't know. I look at it, and then I would drive my boat over there and take a look at it with my own eyes so that I can identify exactly what I'm seeing. I've seen schools of fish where I'm like, point at them. Okay, what are these? I drive over there, it's a whole school of sunfish, or it's a bunch of bass. Okay, so you know, hey, that's what smaller fish look like. And then it's just that learning curve. It cuts that learning curve. If you can spend some time just experimenting with your electronics versus just going out there and you got people in the boat and pressure, and you know the landing was a nightmare and you got the kids screaming, you know, it's all that. It's tough to do it when you're under pressure like that. But if you can just go out on your own, or even with someone that really knows electronics, like if you're up on Leech Lake, for example, like a guide or somebody that's super good with their electronics, it shortens that learning curve so much. And it really, these new electronics are super easy to use. Forward facing sonar is pretty darn easy. I mean, anybody can really navigate it, because once you it's not like the old electronics where you kind of had to decipher, is that a fish? That, you know, what is it? What am I seeing? You know what you're seeing because it's live. It's fish striking baits. It's fish swimming. It's just getting really good at identifying species and vegetation and what you're seeing on there. And your distances. That's the largest part to that whole game. So I would not be intimidated by any of these new electronics or forward facing sonar. It truly is super simple to use. So I'll flip these lights on. I can answer any questions you have. If you have any fishing related questions, I always leave every seminar. We got to take kids fishing. Forward facing sonar electronics are super cool for kids. I have teenagers and they love to fish. They've always loved to fish since they've been little kids. But they really love electronics, right? They love underwater cameras in the winter, like this winter with Mille Lacs Lake with the perch bite the way it was. I almost always brought the Markham cameras out. And I mean, I wouldn't hear from these kids it would be 6 o'clock at night. I'd be banging on the otter trying to get them out of there because they're so focused on fishing. And these are some of my son's friends that don't really even fish, you know? So we do the same thing with forward facing sonar in the summer. The electronics, they absolutely gravitate towards it, and you can get kids in the boat and you can spend a lot more time fishing and enjoying it, you know, when you have that electronic element. I mean, they live in that world where they're always staring at screens. So take it from, you know, a dad that I always used to invent ways to keep my kids in the boat longer, you know, with snacks and minnows, and I would throw some sunfish in so they could play in the live well. Now with teenagers, I just turn them over to the electronics. I bring an ice bundle in the boat for each of them, and I barely hear them in the back of the boat. I can fish in the front of the boat all day long. So,
Do you tie all your baits and jigs direct or use snaps?
That's a great question. He asked if I use snaps. I sometimes use snaps for certain baits. Other times I tie direct. Like these plastics, hair jigs, I almost always tie direct. So I hardly ever use a snap for those. Sometimes I'll use a snap for jigging wraps. Crankbaits, I almost always use a snap. Jerk baits, I go back and forth. It depends if I need to kill the action on the bait, but a lot of times I'll use a snap.
Stored properly, how long do scented plastics last?
Quite a while. I mean, you got to be careful with some of these baits that you don't pile them in a tackle box with a bunch of other plastics because they'll kind of melt and weld themselves together. So I try to keep them in the packaging if I can. And I've got little kind of soft-sided boxes that I'll put these. But if I'm using a particular bait, I just set it in my glove compartment. And then when I'm done at the end of the day, I'll try to shove it in here. Like I said, a lot of these plastics, though, are pretty durable. So, you know, like this one, I caught a ton of fish on it. You could barely even tell it's been used, you know. it's amazing how durable these plastics are nowadays, especially like these Crush City plastics.
Do they last 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year?
I don't know.
Okay.
I suppose until the scent dries up, but I have some older plastics that I know are 15 years old that still have scent to them. So it's a matter of the sometimes if the plastic breaks down, you know.
Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the other day a shroud for FFS modules. Is that a thing in tournaments now, or is that, I mean, do they okay using those when you're in a tournament that you can't use sonar?
That's the big debate. Some of he asked if for forward facing sonar, if you can use them in tournaments or a certain amount. Certain tournaments, like muskies, they ban, certain tournament trails, they banned it for muskies in certain situations. I know in a certain bass leagues, they only allow you to have one unit, or, because I was just up at the Rainy River, there were people where they had 4 units on their console, okay, and only one of which they were using for forward facing, but then up front they had 4 units, and but what they were doing is on their pole, and then also up front they had 1 unit that was forward, and then one that was in perspective or scout mode. So that way, if they saw fish over here, they point their forward facing to it, and they could cast to it. So they had, 2 units that they're isolating at the console, 2 units up front, and then they also had units on poles in the back that were on track systems. And so, I think some of the tournaments are trying to limit maybe some of that. That's sort of extreme. But, like Doug and I were talking, you still have to get them to bite, right? If I could set anybody up with all those electronics on the Rainy River, or like when I was on Green Bay, and if you weren't doing that particular bite, for example, you just weren't getting bit. Like if you wanted to cast at those fish, like on Rainy, they weren't eating it, at least when I was up there. By the weekend, that last weekend of walleye, when the walleyes were open 2 weeks ago, they started biting a little bit more aggressively, but it was more of a dragging bite. So you still have to figure that sort of thing out. I also say too, is like, as anglers, as we get better with electronics and we get to be better anglers, really just have to be good stewards of our resources, and not abusing it, not, someone going out and taking double limits and going out every day and getting their limit. I mean, I always think of a fishing experience. It's all about the experience, right? I want to catch a lot of fish. But I want to do that again, and I want to show my kids, and I want to have these resources around for a long time. And so, I'm all about catching fish, but making sure I'm doing it in a proper manner. For example, not going out and targeting walleyes or crappies or species in 30, 40 feet of water. I mean, now with forward-facing sonar, I tend to pitch at more fish than I used to, right? And I tend to fish shallower than I used to because I can see them there. I cited an example of catching them on the inside edge of the weed line. It was July when I did that. I would have never looked for those fish there, prior to that. So yes, I was catching them more frequently, but all those fish got returned to the water, and I caught them in 4 feet of water, so I never hurt one of them. So, there's pros and cons to the debate with forward-facing sonar. And some people love it, some people hate it. You don't need it to catch fish. I can still go out with all the other electronics and power fish my way through areas and catch them. It's systematically more efficient. And I like it from that aspect. Plus, as an angler, I say it all the time, I love discovering new things, new bites, fish in areas that I would have never looked, catching largemouth bass in areas that I thought only walleyes existed, catching walleyes in areas that I thought only bass existed. And that's what makes fishing fun for me. It's not going out and filling my live hole. That's not my goal. And so that's why I enjoy forward-facing sonar, and that's why I love fishing a lot of artificials and getting very proficient at catching them on all different presentations. Yes, sir.
Do you have any advice fishing rock hunts like Rainy River?
Yeah.
In Canada, like the woods,
Like what he asked, advice for fishing rock humps?
Yeah, so you get, you get those rock humps, and some of them come up way up, maybe 4 or 5 feet underwater. They might have a ledge, sharp drop. Others are just a pile of rock. And it's usually, not under 30 feet of water or something like that. I'm just curious, that's something you have done a lot of?
Yeah.
Some of, and you have your place.
So I used to guide up at Lake of the Woods in college in the Northwest Angle. And then, I still go up to Canada quite a bit on the Ontario side. Obviously there's tons of different humps and they're all different, right? Some of them are just bedrock, where it's just like this big massive bedrock. Other ones are more chunky rocks. What a lot of people don't understand is like some of the shoreline structures too, and even some of the mid-lake humps, there's a lot of current, okay? There's always current moving on a lot of those lakes. Most of the lakes in Canada they're flowages basically, right? It's just one big river system. And so whether the wind's blowing or the current's moving, the fish are gonna kind of line up on that, facing into the current. I always joke around, but I didn't grow up fishing like Red Wing River, right? I fished some small rivers around my house. The Mississippi River is about, a quarter of the size of this room where I grew up. And so I fished that up there, but I never fished down on Red Wing or anything. So I was sort of intimidated by rivers when I got to be, 17, 18, 19, I started fishing on my own. And I remember asking my Uncle Gary, I was like, God, how do you fish the river? Where do you look? And he said, well, when the water's high and raging, those fish are up on the bank. When it gets low, they're down in the channel. And he's like, put it this way, they're always facing up into the current. And I thought, oh, that makes sense, And that sort of light bulb moment, I always think about that when I'm fishing humps, even on lakes where the wind's blowing or whatever. Those fish are always sort of chasing. Now with forward facing sonar, I always used to think they're always just sitting there because you saw them on 2D sonar and they were sitting there. Well, they're there, but they're not sitting, they're moving. And so that's what I love about using these power fishing methods where I can pitch and snap a bait through there, is I can get a trigger, a strike a lot of times. So on those rock humps, I throw a lot of plastics, a lot of paddle tails. I throw a ton of jigging wraps. In some of that real stained water, again, I like upsizing my plastic where I'll use either a bigger hair jig or a larger profile plastic so they can feel that. I also, depending on depth, will vary the size of the jig head that I'm using, or depending on the current or the wind will dictate my jig head size that I'm coupling with my plastic. Any other questions?
How do you like those micro guides on your rod compared to the other ones?
Well, these ones aren't complete micro guides, but I like them for casting. I think you can get a little bit more distance out of them. Some of the rods have the really, really tiny ones. These seem to work great. I mean, I'm gonna hook baits a long distance. What I like about these rods, it's got a super light blank, and then of course the reel seat and the handle itself is a little bit smaller, but it's also comfortable. Like when you're fishing a jig wrap all day, or you're casting and snapping plastics all day long, if you got a real bulky reel seat or something that's not comfortable in your hand, it wears on you. Or if you got a real heavy blank, like if you're snapping jig wraps all day, I mean, I'm telling you, you get fatigued from doing that. So I like something that utilizes like a lighter blank, and then of course, has a really nice, comfortable handle.
Are you able to use jigging wraps on the river at all? Is that something that you utilize?
Yeah. I
Do you
mean,
cast it, or you just drop it behind the boat?
well, I like to cast. The problem with the river is you might want to stock up downstairs because they eat a lot of traps with all the timber and stuff. But what's nice about forward facing sonar is you can tell, like, I can decide if I'm going to cast into that or not. I mean, if there's a log jam or it's really gnarly rock, I might pick up something else, like throw a plastic up in there or something a little different than a jig wrap. It's like when I first started really getting into fishing jig wraps in the summer, I was actually out in Devil's Lake, and I was trying to throw the jig wraps up in between the trees. there was a big point that stuck out where there's a bunch of trees, right? And the current was blowing through there. So all the walleyes were stacked up in these trees, and I caught them on jigging wraps. Like the first few casts, I was like, oh, boom, whacking them on jigging wraps. But then I lost jigging wraps. Then I lost another one. And I was like, okay, I need to use something else. And I switched to just a plastic, paddle tail, and I wasn't breaking off as much. I was catching more fish. It just moves through that timber so much easier. So you have to sort of pick and choose where you're going to be able to fish that bait. All right, guys, before you take off, like always, there's a drawing. Thank you so much for coming out. Good luck fishing this summer.